I'm Stephanie Grace. I'm a columnist and editorial payout. Thank you. My friend Michael. I'm not the show, but I write for the Times-Picayune and the Advocate. I've been covering politics in Louisiana for about 30 years, so I have some stories to tell, as does our guest. Jason Berry, as I think probably a lot of people here know, is an acclaimed journalist, historian, documentarian, playwright, has written extensively about the Catholic Church before other people were doing it, the pedophile scandals, about New Orleans culture, jazz, all kinds of things. And it turns out he's a novelist too. So that's what we're here to talk about today. Jason has a book called The Last of the Red Hot Poppas, which is his only novel to date, correct? And let's talk about it. You know, for one thing, it is a reissue of a book that came out a while ago. So how does that work? Why? Well, okay, let's back up. Let's talk about the book. The book is a political satire. It's kind of a murder mystery. It has injection wells. It's about Louisiana environment. The main character is actually the governor of Louisiana, kind of a charming rogue, populist, likes the ladies, maybe inspired by someone we all remember. Is Rex LaSalle Edwin Edwards?
I would say, had there never been an Edwin Edwards, there would have been a Rex LaSalle, okay. Some tragicomic figure to embody the surreal state of democracy in these latitudes. I did a lot of environmental reporting in the late 70s and early 80s, much of it in Cajun country. And Edwards' environmental policies were just a study in naked cynicism. There were these huge 18-wheeler trucks coming over from Houston to these fly-by-night dumping pits and discharging all these lethal chemicals. And one of his brothers and his cronies were all involved in leasing and making a great deal of money. And I was naturally appalled. I was young. It's easier to get appalled when you're young, I think. So I went off to France. I was on a journalism, kind of a fellowship. It's called Journalists in Europe. This was back in '82. And I wrote about 90 pages. And when I got back, I was trying to figure out where this story was going. And as time passed, I realized that the only way I could make sense of it, in between a lot of books and reporting on the Catholic Church and other things, was to sort of turn the premise around and make it a comedy. And it is a comedy. The only thing I would moderately dispute, and of course you run a serious risk if you ever challenge a reporter, especially in public. But Stephanie, I don't think it's a satire, and for this reason. Some of the minor characters are maybe a little bit satirical, but this is a novel about a cover-up, and so I take the absolute Fifth Amendment that any projection was going on. After all, I'd been writing about the Catholic bishops, but. Everyone sucked into the cover-up in this novel. They have to figure out who killed the big man. The First Lady has to figure out, well, who killed him and why, and then bury him with dignity. And all the people drawn into this tangled web at one time or another are talking to God, trying to rationalize why they're doing what they're doing. So that's a slight difference from satire, but I yield the floor.
I guess, is that do you think that's what was going on with the Catholic Church? Is that, were they rationalizing?
I do take the Fifth Amendment on that one.
You have to think. Do they think, because again, none of your characters seem to have a guilty conscience. They wrestle, but they rationalize, like you say, that's a good way of putting it. Even the guy who's really kind of the hero of the book, who's, I should say, he's a lawyer, interesting character who is, he's the child of a white civil rights lawyer who kind of grew up as a pariah because that's what happened to those people in those days. He went off, left Louisiana, came back when his father died to help his mother, ended up working for the Attorney General's office, and ended up, he's kind of, in one way, he's like the straight man in that he's the kind of audience representative, kind of observing this corrupt, transactional world. But he also gets kind of transactional himself. Is he based on anyone?
I don't have a law degree. I guess Henry Hubble, in a sense, is a bit of a reflection on what I was like at 32, appalled by all this. But there's a moment.
But drawn to it.
I'm sorry?
But drawn to it, absolutely.
Well, what is it in Lear is flies to wanton boss, the gods, they crush us for their sport. I realized as I got into writing, I guess it was the second draft, I realized that his changes as a character were fundamental to the story and how I wanted to tell it. So to the degree that I was almost agog at there's one line that I took from, I was covering an environmental bill that was just getting slaughtered in the legislature. This was 81, I think. And there was a moment where they took a break, and these two good old boy legislators from the House were walking across the rotunda. And this one guy says to the other, "Look, I agree with all you want to do. I'm just powerful concerned about the legality of it." And, that little idea kind of threads through the narrative.
Well, they certainly seem to, your characters, there are a lot of legislators in the kind of cast of wacky characters, and they seem to see the legal impediments as, maybe say a little bit of a speed bump, but that's about it
Right.
to what they want to do. I'm wondering, again, I mentioned it's a reissue, that the book was written when Governor Edwards was the first Governor Edwards, I should be very specific, was A, still alive, and B, in prison.
Yes. The book came out, and anyway, I should put cards on the table and just tell you how the book got published. Without giving away the plot, there's a huge flood in Baton Rouge at a climactic point near the end. And the book had been to several houses in New York. I wasn't getting any momentum there. And then Katrina hit. And I was invited to contribute an article to a wonderful little anthology called "Do You Know What It Means to Miss New Orleans?" Some of you perhaps have read it. And the publisher, a guy named Bruce Rutledge with a small press, Chin Music Press in Seattle, called me to ask if I had any bookstore media contacts, so I helped him. And then I finally said, "I noticed from your catalog that you publish fiction. I have this novel. Oh, well, send it on." Boom, I got a contract offer within a month, and so I was thrilled. The only mishap along the way to fame as a novelist is that it came out amidst all of the big Katrina books, and it kind of got lost in the shuffle. But by the way, there is a wonderful trailer for the novel. If you just put in the novel and put in trailer, you'll get it. So the book came out. It was very nicely reviewed, and I kept thinking, I want to get this out in paperback, and my life has just been one attempt to dodge a speed bump after another. And finally, I thought, I want to get this back out. And I did send a copy to Edwin Edwards when he was in the penitentiary.
So he had lots of time to read, I guess.
And what I got back was he sent out these form letters to all of his constituents, or friends, I guess, his base. I don't know who paid for the postage or how he worked that out, but
I'm sure he had.
No, I think he had it worked out. Yes. But anyway, so I get this letter back, and he writes on it, "Got the book. Thanks! Exclamation point. Interesting! Exclamation point." So I never actually got to ask him what he thought. I don't know what he thought, but the character is both flattering and not. What he probably didn't like is that the guy dies on page 2.
Yes. True, yes. But he's charming. He's got this weakness, but one thing that's interesting is he does stay married to the first wife until the end, even while he's doing who is a main character who kind of wants to find out what happened, but also not let the rest of the world control the story, let's just say.
Well, I think in a way, Amelia LaSalle is certainly a character with more inherent surprises than the governor. I mean, I really play up his promiscuity by saying he wore Elvis disguises and these little Zydeco clubs and things like that. So, he comes off as this flamboyant, larger-than-life character who thinks that nobody knows he's having an affair with the manager of this Zydeco band.
In one scene, his daughter kind of sees him at a club and is like, "That's my father," in the disguise over there dancing with the LSU coach.
Yeah, it's a rough transition.
It's a rough scene, yes.
Family values.
Yes.
But Amelia is a regal personality in many ways. And, as I was working on this character, I kept thinking, well, what will make her intriguing to the reader beyond being the first lady of the state? And so I made her an art collector. And there's a whole strand in the scenes involving her in which her collection of African art, her collection of photography is drawing people. And there's one scene where I don't use the word Christian nationalism because at that time it really wasn't a term. The word that all of the political people used back then was, quote, the born-agains. And so there's a scene where one of the born-agains, who happens to be an Assembly of God's preacher in Rapides Parish, condemns her for putting pagan art in the governor's mansion. And Rex sends her a note and says, get rid of it. And so instead, she goes to this little church and brings these African masks and shows the people in this church with huge press in attendance that these are acts, artistic works of the spiritual imagination. And she explains the tribal, the New York Times does an editorial saying a cultural bridge builder. So she comes home and there are 24 red roses. So, she's kind of a foil to his extravagance, and yet the deeper she goes into her suffering and her anger at the way he died, I think her character moves to another level, and she's not just a typical political wife.
Were there other politicians you can name who inspired some of your characters, or obviously you come out of journalism but this is fiction. Where is the line? Is there?
Well, I took a lot of liberties. The lieutenant governor is Joe Hall. He's not really based on anybody. He's this alcoholic without parallel among his peers. And the moment the governor dies, they're trying to figure out, how do we get rid of this guy? We can't let him become governor. So, it's kind of like a mirror of the cover-up. It's a dual cover-up. I'm trying to think if there's anyone. Well, Jimmy Davis makes a little cameo appearance. I interviewed him. I think he was 98, and not. Well, it played into the book in a minor way, but he lived in a house literally next to the governor's mansion. And I realized that he was still alive, and most people didn't know it. So I did a profile of him, and when I called him on the phone to get directions, I said, well, this is, before Google Maps and all that. And I said, well, Governor, how do I get to your home? And he said, well, you take the road to the mansion, and I live in the house next door. It's not as big, but it's a very nice house. And then he said, and it's got a white picket fence. And then I hear a female voice saying, Jimmy, it's not white picket. Well, it's a fence, son, and you'll find it.
Nice. So as I mentioned, have been covering politics for a long time in this state and have all kinds of wacky stories of things I have seen, experienced, conversations I've had with politicians. And people sometimes ask me, I tell these stories and they say, you should write a book, you should write a novel. And my reaction is, I could not make this stuff up. Have you always been interested in writing fiction?
Oh yeah, I'm a failed novelist, really.
Okay. Well, hopefully not anymore.
No, I was in my younger and more vulnerable years. I did 2 brilliant novels in my 20s, and the sophists of New York did not recognize that illuminated talent. So I just kept making a living because I was a freelance. But, there's a scene, a very pivotal scene in the Capitol where Reverend Christian Froh, an African-American minister and an undertaker from Cajun country, is given charge by the First Lady to handle the remains. And so, also with her permission, he goes to the ceremony and he has to give this eulogy of the governor. I borrowed from some notes, but mostly memory, the eulogy that Bishop Paul Morton gave for the gospel singer Raymond Miles.
Wow.
This was before Katrina, and he had a huge church out in New Orleans East. And Raymond sadly was murdered. And so there was tremendous emotion.
And Paul Morton, I should say, was a very powerful political figure.
He was indeed.
In addition to being.
He was indeed. Edwin Edwards knelt before him 2 nights before the runoff with David Duke. And I guess God winked. We beat the Nazi. He has a sermon from Psalms where in the Babylonian captivity, the children of Israel are crossing the river and their harps are hanging in a tree. And Morton said something to the effect, we must get our harps, we must praise it. He was trying to say, even though Raymond died tragically, we must remember who we are and we must sing, we must raise up for the Lord. It was one of the most powerful speeches, oratories I've ever seen. So with some changes, I put those words in the monologue of Reverend Christian Froh. And at one point he says, will Louisiana be Babylon? Mm-hmm. And that kind of shakes up the room a bit. And there was so much about that character.
As if that's a question. I mean, but go on.
Well, some people would say it's rhetorical, you know. But there was so much about that character I fell in love with because I've interviewed a great many African-American ministers for the music writing I've done, and also some of the cultural and political writing. Ministers, as you know, are often very powerful people in a given community. And Froh really becomes the sort of moral intelligence of the novel. And the way in which he is rationalizing the work he has to do to bury the governor with dignity is sort of counterposed with all of these ethical and moral questions that Henry Hubble has. He's been given access to secret tapes and things like that. So in a sense, you know, when you have the luxury of playing God with your characters in nonfiction, you certainly do not. Moving through their respective points of view, their consciousness, plural, I found Hubble leaning toward Froh for affirmation, which at the same time that the First Lady is doing the same thing.
Right.
So,
and of course, Froh had been Hubble's father's ally in the civil rights struggle earlier.
That's right.
Right.
And I must say, there's a wonderful new introduction by Maurice Carlos Ruffin. I'm sure many of you know his work. And he has a lot to say about Fro, which I found very gratifying. And I'm a great admirer of Maurice's work as well.
That's one of the things that struck me in this book is you kind of wove together a lot of very big themes that kind of underlie Louisiana politics. And one of them, what Maurice wrote about, I thought, in the way he opened his introduction, is he talked about it being kind of a portrait of a particular time. And to me, that's really interesting because I think a lot of people talk about how these days about how we are still living with the remnants of slavery, the after effects of slavery. I think we're also living with kind of the after effects of the civil rights movement. And this kind of, and it very much kind of haunts this book. It haunts Henry Hubble because, again, this experience of being the child of, maybe someone who's like a Moon Landrieu figure, who was kind of early, was one of the first white people to be openly, work for civil rights, and the effect it had on their family is very much with him still. And also just the relationships between the white politicians and Fro, the African American minister. I mean, it's friendly, but it's suspicious, and it's kind of transactional, and I think we kind of still see that today a lot.
Well, one of the points I revised the introduction that I did to say that wait a minute, it's my book, I can read from it.
Absolutely. Writer's privilege.
To live in Louisiana pits the civilized mind against a tradition of politics and religion that once seemed bizarre, yet stands now as a mere foreshadowing of the bombastic culture of Washington, D.C., in a swoon to Donald Trump, the most craven demagogue in U.S. history. Figures like the Longs, Edwards, Jimmy Swaggart, and others one could name from these American tropics challenge the literary artist to do reality one better. Nobody gives it to you. When you look at where we are right now politically, the power structure in control is so utterly reactionary. And I think Maurice really hit on something when he said that politically, the milieu or the environment of the mid-90s, when the book is set, he very, to my mind, beautifully makes a comparison to Virginia Woolf and says that when you read her novels, you know where you are in English history.
You know where and when you are.
Yes, where and when you are.
Yeah.
And I guess this novel does the same thing, although I hope in whatever realm she inhabits, Virginia Woolf is nodding. But I think, this is happening all across the South. I mean, the gains, not just politically of the civil rights movement, basically the civility that I think emerged after legislation changed has, I don't want to say it's been completely lost, but if you drive up 59 into Mississippi and you see Welcome to Mississippi, the sign says, Welcome to Mississippi, home of the blues. And then you get to Jackson, where they don't have a clean water system because the governor's sitting on $1 billion in escrow and won't fix the piping system. I mean, this is a throwback to the 1950s with the White Citizens Council in control. It's a sad reality, but I would encourage all of you to get this book because it's a spiritual comedy. And Edwin Edwards comes out looking okay by default.
He does, actually. That is true.
Never speak ill of the dead.
He's not the worst. He's definitely not the worst in this. I wanted, since you picked up the book, let's pick it up again because you have a story to tell about the cover, I believe.
I do. The very modest young lady against the wall over there, my daughter Simonette.
Hi.
She did the cover, and there's absolutely no nepotism involved.
I'm sure it was a big payday for you.
We're working on that. It's an installment plan, but it's a substantial one. We had a conversation. Thank you, Michael. We had a conversation about what the cover should be like, And I said, so what do you think? And she said, an alligator. And I said, yes, absolutely, an alligator. So the
I don't know
alligator,
if you can all see it,
if you can
but-
do a tight shot, maybe, I don't know if you can, but
There you go.
an alligator kind of encroaches on the cover. It's a
It
rather,
wraps around the
Yeah.
spine. It's lovely.
and so I think the alligator is sort of a decadent symbol of who we are. The Pelican State we used to be called. I mean, maybe we still are the Pelican, but I think ever since Ryan Fertel did a terrific book on the brown pelican, about the post BP pollution. But the alligator population is booming. In fact, one of my granddaughters, who's about to get a degree in biological engineering, had a summer job and was telling Melanie and me about what she was seeing from this helicopter. You wouldn't believe the alligators; they're everywhere. And we certainly read news stories about alligators. So I thank you for the beautiful cover.
It is beautiful, yes. You mentioned this decadent moment we're in and the kind of power of the oil and gas industry and the relationship between the political structure and that industry really permeates that book. And I wonder, do you want to comment on the moment we're in Louisiana right now and the new regime, which is obviously very close to that industry?
Well, we're marching toward the 1950s. I think it's obvious that Landry wants to gut the reforms in criminal justice that John Bell Edwards made, and
He already has.
he has.
Yeah.
And I think putting the Coastal Restoration Department under the Department of Natural Resources, which gives out the award, the permits for drilling, is a terrible mistake. But there's a sense of no boundaries right now. I think what Trump demonstrated to many of his core followers, I'm talking about politicians, is that you can say almost anything and get away with it. I don't know how 91 felony counts, or maybe it's...
I think it's down to 80 something.
Yeah, 83 now, I think, I don't know how all that will play out, but sooner or later, I think there is going to be a massive reaction. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that will happen in this state. Certainly the Democratic Party seems brain dead. They don't have any real activism or momentum behind them, but times change.
Right. And there was a Republican anybody but Landry movement that fizzled. Yeah. Anyway.
One point worth making, though, with regard to contemporary politics, is that Trump has the entire Republican apparatus under his thumb. I mean, you look at the Speaker of the House. If he does not go gently into the night that he deserves, sooner or later, when you have one person at the top and so much of the structure dictated by one person, there's going to be an enormous vacuum to fill, and a great scramble for power. Now, alternatively, he could win the election, but if that is not the case, how the Republican method of governing changes will, I think, be a fascinating story to watch, because right now they are pretty much dictating policy to all these state legislatures, which historically has not been the case. But again, we're far from knowing how that will play out.
Right, and we're very early in our own experiment right now. Before we go to questions, I want to ask, pivot a little bit to your work on the Catholic Church, which goes back to the early 80s.
85.
85, if before Spotlight, obviously. There was actually a shout out to you in Spotlight.
I know.
Which was nice, as one of the pioneers. But, did you ever imagine back then that you would still be writing about this and how systemic it all would be?
No. In fact, I several times tried to escape it. When I published Lead Us Not into Temptation in 92, that's the book they hold up for a cameo of Spotlight. I got 500 emails from that one movie scene. I figured by 94, gave more speeches and did some articles. But I figured, okay, I've said my piece. I'm Cincinnatus. I'm going to go find the plow. And I just kept getting more and more information, including the case that ended up at the Vatican about Father Maciel of Mexico. I was contacted by men from Mexico. And it just kept trailing me. And even though I took time off to, I finished this novel after the second book, Vows of Silence, and then soon along I had a contract to do Render Unto Rome, the book about the Vatican finances and how the church is selling real estate to cover the bills for all the abuse cases. I pretty much resolved to put it all behind me about 7 years ago, 8 years ago. I'm still good for the occasional op-ed. Well, I did a series for The Guardian.
You did, yes.
I did.
Very recently.
I did, yeah.
Yes.
Well, I can go out my back door and see the Archbishop's backyard. And, it's hard to cut away from something, excuse me. When you grow up, as I did, in a culture where faith and family and the city with these carnival rituals all conveyed the idea that, the world is of a piece. And I went through Jesuit in the 60s when the two public narratives were the Civil Rights Movement and Vatican II Reform Council in Rome. And I was quite deeply stamped by that. And but I never imagined, the parallel I see today. I use the term structural mendacity in talking about the bishops, the inability to be truthful. And of course, now with all these hidden documents that are in bankruptcy cases and plaintiff lawyers trying to get them, this is a criminal sexual underground that's largely been hidden for many years in spite of all the news coverage. And with no disrespect to Republicans who yearn for the party to be the way it once was, the fog machine, to quote James Carville, of lies that has become such an overpowering reality in national politics is another form of structural mendacity. And I appreciate the human comedy. Part of that comes from, I guess, my love of music. And Dr. Michael White, the protagonist of my current film, City of a Million Dreams, has kindly graced us with his presence. But when lying becomes so widely accepted, how do you teach civics? I don't even know if we have courses in civics anymore. But we desperately need some principled center where people of the reasonable right and reasonable left can meet. I never thought I would pine for people like Howard Baker of Tennessee, who in retrospect looks better and better, not just because he said, I want to know what the president knew and when he knew it, but these were reasonable people. You interview older politicians, especially from Washington, and they all talk about how they could get together and argue during the day and go out and have dinner that night. I don't know if we'll ever get back there, but I think many people in the country wish that we could.
And, people say that in Baton Rouge, that is a culture that also is very threatened, that probably held on a little longer than in Washington, but maybe not so much anymore. Let's, first of all, let's go to questions. I don't know where Faith has the microphone. And I should say this clock is not working, so tell me when we're ready to wrap it up. And
If you
any questions, anybody?
can raise your hand and I'll come to you with the microphone.
I want to give a shout out to a second work of Jason Berry fiction that doesn't get enough attention, which is Earl Long in Purgatory.
Well, it's a play actually, but thank you.
but it was a work of made up stuff.
I did say playwright in the long list.
Well, I plagiarized a lot of what he said.
Right. And Earl Long was a real person.
He was.
But it was not a work of journalism.
No,
it
he
was
was
a
in
work of
purgatory,
imagination
Although
based on.
Erlong was the Red Hot Papa, right?
Well, he called himself last of the Red Hot Poppas, so I'm trying to get dual advertising.
So I'd love to see this work its way into a play and film, and I'm knowing you well enough to know that you have thought of that at least. And the second question I have is a little more philosophical, which is I remember something you said either in print or in conversation many, many years ago, which is this kind of the dichotomy in Louisiana and also not in Louisiana between the entertaining factor of the entertainment of politics versus the smokescreen of the entertainment of the entertainment factor of politics and all the dirty work that's being done behind that. And I just want to ask you, how do you balance your enjoyment of the stories with all the darkness and all the malfeasance that they are put up there in many ways to sort of act as a smokescreen for?
I listen to a lot of music. I watched Edwin Edwards for many years, as most of the people here did, and I was continually struck at how witty he was and how well he would have done as a comic actor. But the fact that he opened the state to massive environmental pollution was something I just couldn't get away from. And when he died, the obituaries, well, I better not go too far on this, but let's just say I decided I wanted to do an article on what many of the career summaries had not gone into in great depth. So I pulled out a lot of the reporting I'd done on the waste pit deals, especially in Acadiana, and I got The Nation to publish it. Michael, it's a really good question because how do you balance the extravagance of entertainment? I mean, look at Donald Trump. I mean, this man, in his own way, is a kind of genius on the stump. He galvanizes his followers. They don't, it appears, add up to more than about 40%. But the election is going to hinge on that narrow band of people, maybe 15 to 18%, maybe 20% in the middle, unless, of course, the criminal justice system takes him away. Reporters, writers can't help but get juiced up over the entertaining factor of demagoguery. On the other hand, how do you work as a straight man in telling people, yeah, that's a great line. I'm safe with the voters unless I'm caught in bed with a dead woman or a live boy. I mean, this is one of the legendary quotes in American politics. He beat Dave Treen that year in 1983, I think 62 to 38 or something like that. And Treen actually had TV spots saying, I'm standing in front of one of these places that's on the Superfund now list because of Edwin Edwards. That didn't ring a bell with anybody. Mm-hmm. Human nature is a tough call.
Can I just add, it's not just journalists. I was not around to cover most of Edwin Edwards, but when he got out of prison, he ran for Congress, remember, against Garrett Graves in the 6th District, which is a very gerrymandered, very, very Republican district. And I spent a day out campaigning with him just to see what it was like, and he went to Livingston Parish, very conservative areas. They could not get enough of him. I mean, and these people, there was no way they were ever going to vote for him, but they loved him, and he made his suggestive jokes, and he, things that were completely inappropriate even by then, and women laughed, men laughed, everybody. It was just as if they had just been taken out of their bodies, and it was this, and again, it was disconnected from politics. It was disconnected from their vote at that point, but it just see the power of it. And to see how people who probably hated everything he stood for just be so taken by him was pretty amazing.
I interviewed him at the Crowley Rice Festival in 1991 when he was running against Duke. This is a big event in Acadiana every year, and there was a motorcade through a parade through the town with the two candidates, and Edwards was sitting in an SUV, waving from the window, and there were marksmen on top of the buildings. So obviously there had been death threats. And then Duke comes around the corner, and he's got his tie a little bit askew, and he's going like this, and his blonde hair is tousled in the manner of the ancient Greeks. I will pass over the plastic surgery. So, here he comes. It's like a scene from Triumph of the Will. So I go out with some of the journalists. We got to this private red beans and rice thing. Somebody had a ranch out there. And I sidled up to him, and he was eating a plate of red beans. I said, "Governor, would you mind if I ask you a question?" He said, "No, go ahead." And I said, "What will it take for you to win this race?" And he said, "Oh, to stay alive." I mean, there's a part of you that has to like a guy like that.
Yeah.
So I hope he has time to read the book and reflect on it.
Other questions? Peter?
Yes.
Did you have any relationship with Marty Baron and the Boston Globe people as they were kind of plowing a field that I think you probably felt like you plowed 2 decades earlier?
One decade, Mr. Editor. Not Barron per se. I met him much later at an IRE conference, but I knew all of the people in the Spotlight team. In fact, I got an invitation within a week or two to contribute to their commentary page, which I did that year. I'll tell you a great Spotlight story. I was sitting at my desk one day, and the phone rings, and it was Mike Resendez, the guy who's played by Mark Ruffalo in the movie. And he says, "Hey, man, I really need a favor." I said, "Yeah, what do you need?" And he says, well, we're on the set in Toronto. And I said, "Oh." And I knew vaguely that they were making this movie. I didn't connect with Toronto. And I said, "What are you doing in Toronto?" He said, "Well, they're making the movie Spotlight." Oh. And he said, and the script writer's right here, and we called Doubleday because we want to put the cover of your book on the screen. And the Doubleday lawyer said, "No, you can't do that.
Oh.
Can you help us out?" And I said, "Yeah, that lawyer. Of course I give you permission." "Oh, well, I mean, it was now with a different publisher, I said, and he said, "Well, can you write an email?" I said, "Yeah, sure." So I write this email. The script writer gets on. "Oh, this is great." I went on. I didn't think anything of it. I don't know, a year or so later, I'm standing at a reception in the New Orleans Museum of Art. I think it was August. And a lady comes up to me, and she said, "I saw the movie." I had no idea what she was talking about. And I didn't know her personally, although she had a certain air, but certain ladies you see at art openings. And I said, I better not go too deep on this one. And I said, "Oh, what did you think?" She said, "Well, it's a very powerful film. And the cover of your book is right there for 30 seconds. Well, of course, then I knew. And I just blurted out to her, I thought I was going to be on the cutting room floor. And so anyway, I thought they did a great job with the film. In fact, I was profiled. Some of you may know this, some not. But since you asked the question, I get to answer it. My microphone, Mr. Green. I was profiled, I guess about 3 or 4 years ago, by a guy who has since won 2 Academy Awards for short docs, Ben Proudfoot. And his research producer called me and said, "I've been reading your articles going back to the 1980s and 90s. What did you think of Spotlight?" And I said, "Oh, I thought it was a great film." And she said, "Well, they covered a lot of the territory you covered." And I said, yeah, they did. "Well, didn't that bother you?" And I said, "No, frankly, I got a lot of assignments from them, and then soon along, I got a contract for my second book on the church, which I don't think would have happened absent the Globe." And of course, I knew she was fishing, you know. Well, didn't you feel a little kind of, yeah. And the truth is I don't, because I got to know them all. They're great colleagues, great people. I just read Barron's book on the Washington Post and Trump. I thought it was terrific. So they did this OpDocs profile of me. If you just do my name, NYT OpDocs, it'll pull up. And it's about 15 minutes. It's a very flattering profile. And I don't know, the world works in mysterious ways. And, you know, I look back on all those years writing about the church, and I'm still kind of amazed that I'm a vertical specimen. I mean, not that they would have attacked me or done anything, but, you know, it was rough emotionally, doing so many interviews with people who've had such traumatized lives.
Last question? Anyone?
Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Stephanie.